Apologists point to that there has been less and less anachronisms over time, going in favor of the Book of Mormon and discovery of items such as cement, metal plate, barley, and that the Book of Mormon is looking less ridiculous over time. Mormonism with the Mirth, where Latter-day Saint explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. So in the last episode, we had a look at Masonry in the Book of Mormon. And does the Book of Mormon, the Gadianton robbers and secret combinations, does that reflect anti-Masonic rhetoric that was happening in Joseph Smith's milieu in 1829? We look at the critics' arguments of anti-Masonic rhetoric happening in Joseph Smith's environment, and that the Masons and their secret oaths and rituals being described as secret combinations, and this being an obvious source and influence for the Gadianton robbers in the Book of Mormon. We look at the Apologetics, and they would refer to some of the dissimilarities between Masonry and the Gadianton robbers. The term secret combinations isn't exclusive to Masonry, but to many secret groups and secret societies throughout history, and other conspiring groups looking to overthrow the government. And Brent Gardner, who is a Mesoamerican anthropologist, pointed to some of the correlations and connections between the Gadiantons and their rise to power in the land northward, resembling the civilization of Teotihuacan, and what led to the destruction of the Nephites. So go back and watch that one if you haven't. In today's episode, we're going to be having a look at probably what is considered to be one of the most common and biggest criticisms against the Book of Mormon's historicity and authenticity, which is anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. We've done some previous episodes looking at some textual anachronisms, such as New Testament passages and Deutero-Isaiah. We're going to be focusing specifically on physical anachronisms, but also maybe a couple of textual ones as well. This is a very big topic, and there is a lot to cover, and this will probably be a longer episode. I'm afraid I'm going to try to do my best, done a lot of research, and I'm going to be focusing a lot more on the apologetic position and their responses to a lot of these anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. And I'll try to summarize and condense as best I can, but this will be a longer video as I want to try to be thorough. So let's dive in. So what is an anachronism? Anachronism is defined as something which is out of time and place, i.e., you can see this picture of Abraham Lincoln with an iPhone. There were no iPhones created in his time, so the iPhone is anachronistic, and therefore this is not a picture from the time of Abraham Lincoln, but is a modern creation. Critics point to what are many anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, including horses, cattle, oxen, sheep, swine, goats, elephants, wheels, chariots, wheat, silk, steel, and iron during the Book of Mormon times. And then why are these things mentioned in the Book of Mormon? And that these anachronisms demonstrate that it is not historical, but a 19th century text. So critics claim that none of these things existed in the ancient Americas thousands of years ago, that they are anachronistic, out of time and out of place. Joseph Smith wouldn't have known this, and this shows that he is the author. It's not historical, it's a 19th century text, and the anachronisms disprove that it is an ancient text. So I won't be spending too much on the critics' position because it's quite a straightforward position, and there's also an interview of Michael Coe where he points out maybe certain things that exist in Mesoamerica, like cocoa beans, jaguars, turkeys, monkeys. Why aren't those things discussed in the Book of Mormon? And so let's have a look at what are some of the main apologetic responses to anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. I'm going to strive to tackle most of the physical anachronisms, but I'm going to start off by looking at sort of the apologetic sort of general response, and then we'll dive into some of the specific ones. We maybe won't be able to cover every single one, but I'm going to try my best to be thorough. So first, initial response, there is a big difference between an apparent or possible anachronism and an actual anachronism. An apparent anachronism is one that, given current data, seems to exist. An apparent anachronism may or may not be recognized as one that might expire given more data. An actual anachronism is one that all agree exists, and that it will be agreed that it will not expire given more time and study, like Abraham Lincoln and his iPhone. No amount of study or looking for more information will confirm that iPhones existed in Abraham Lincoln's day. An example of apparent anachronism is the horse in ancient America. We do not know that there definitely weren't horses in ancient America during Book of Mormon times and in Book of Mormon lands, but given more time, we may find horses. As apologists, we obviously believe that all anachronisms either don't exist or are merely apparent or possible anachronisms. So obviously, to a believer or an apologist who still believes in a historical Book of Mormon, they wouldn't see these anachronisms as definitive. Something to take into account that it should be taken into account that we should have realistic expectations for what will be preserved in Mesoamerica. Mesoamerica has very damp and acidic soil, and many areas have a hot and humid climate. If we are looking for, say, silk as archaeologists, it will be incredibly difficult to find and document, since silk is such a delicate textile that will not survive after 1,000 years. So Fair states three possibilities to approach anachronisms before we dive into some of the specific ones. First is that archaeology and certain objects haven't yet been discovered. To date, only about 1% of Mesoamerican archaeology has been performed for understanding the early pre-classic through early classic periods. Currently, we know so little about this portion of Mesoamerica and have poor enough preservative conditions to not be able to assess these anachronisms adequately. Thus, we shouldn't pass judgment too quickly on the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and that there are limitations with archaeology and what archaeology can find. For example, the Huns of Central Asia and Eastern Europe reportedly had hundreds of thousands of horses, yet remains of these horses are exceptionally rare given what we would expect. However, very few horse remains have been discovered. Given the rarity of Hun horse remains, we should not be disturbed if so far we have not found incontrovertible evidence of Nephite horses. This lesson could be applied to other animals and materials. Lions were considered anachronistic in Israel for centuries. Though discussed in the Bible, it wasn't until recent decades that lion bones were discovered. So sometimes archaeology may be slow in discovering what is talked about in ancient texts. And especially if we have excavated only about less than 1% of all archaeological sites in Mesoamerica, it also means that we don't know everything there is to know, and that certain things could be discovered as well with time. So what was once considered a definitive anachronism may be discovered and may not be. But also at the same time, we may not find it. And apologists would also purport that there's been less anachronisms over time, and we'll talk about that towards the end of the video. So the second point is lone shifting. Lone shifting is basically ancient peoples, different civilizations, peoples calling animals or objects a different name as to what we would call it, and naming it an unfamiliar animal or object, something which they're familiar with. So lone shifting has occurred throughout history. For example, when the Greeks first encountered a large unfamiliar animal in the Nile, they called it hippopotamus, which in ancient Greek means river horse. Anyone would agree that a hippo bears little resemblance to horse, yet the Greeks chose to extend the use of the word horse. Likewise, when the conquistadors arrived in the New World, reintroducing the horse to the Americas, the natives had problems classifying these new animals. The reintroduced Spanish horse was unfamiliar to the Native Americans, and so it became associated with the deer or the tapir. When Cortez and his horses arrived, the Aztecs simply called the unfamiliar horses deer. One Aztec messenger reported to Montezuma, their deer carry them on their backs wherever they wish to go. These deer, our lord, are as tall as the roof of a house. And even some of the Maya called the European horses and donkeys tapirs because they looked so familiar. And the Spaniard likewise extended the definition, calling the native tapir an ass. And other examples could include calling a bison a buffalo. So perhaps the Reformed Egyptian for horse was expanded to include other animals that were in some way horse-like. The most likely animals to be included in the expanded definition of the Book of Mormon are the deer and the tapir. So this lone shifting apologetic, it's often sort of scoffed at and made fun of by critics and ex-Mormons. There's funny memes of tapirs pulling chariots. And to be honest, I do think it's kind of funny. And it's kind of seen as this is really stretching and Weasley apologetics. And we'll talk about the specific animals in a minute. But lone shifting, it is something that we've seen about, looking at ancient history, ancient peoples, calling animals, new animals, which are unfamiliar to them, usually attributing to them names of things which they're familiar with. So something we've seen in, ancient history among ancient civilizations, calling new or unfamiliar animals the name of an animal that they're familiar with, we saw with the Greeks or the Mayans, the Spaniards. So then people would say, well, if these ancient peoples did it, why not the Nephites? The third possibility is a translator's anachronism. So a translator can insert anachronisms when translating ancient text to make it more readable and applicable to them and their audience. So for example, the King James translators added candles in the verse about not putting your light under a bushel, but on a candlestick. However, candles are anachronistic as oil lamps were used in this time period. They didn't exist in Jesus' day. This anachronism doesn't mean the Bible is a fraud or a 17th century text, but that is a 17th century translation of ancient scripts. However, the difficulty is that we don't have the ancient text for the Book of Mormon, the gold plates, so we can't determine what or whom to attribute the anachronism to. Roper states a translator may follow and adopt previous translations, sometimes introducing animals into a text not found there. Similarly, Joseph Smith may have simply followed the King James rendering of animal terms for some Book of Mormon animals, even if the association with some animals in the American Land of Promise may not have been precise. I believe it talks about like a lion, chasing the goats or something in the Book of Mormon. And that is likely just coming from the King James Bible language, because there weren't lions that lived in Mesoamerica. I think that was more of a metaphor as well. Farrer continues, one might wonder, why would God put anachronisms in the Book of Mormon? And they say that he's merely allowing prophets to speak in their weakness after the manner of their language, that they might come to understanding. And as the Doctrine and Covenants informs us about the nature of revelation. So when it comes to anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, really it would fall under these three categories. Either archaeology, we've not found it yet, but we still might. We've only excavated 1% of archaeological sites in Mesoamerica, so there's still a lot there to find. 2, it could be a lone shift. So when the ancient Nephite authors are riding horse, they might have meant a different animal to what we believe it would be. Or 3, it could be a translator's anachronism, and the translator putting the anachronism in the text, like the King James translators, using a candle instead of an oil lamp. And you decide which you find most reasonable. But we're going to look now at some of the specific physical anachronisms which critics would point to. I'm going to be drawing a lot on Farrer and also an article by Matthew Roper and Wade Miller, who have done a lot of work on anachronisms. And I'll put links in the description where you can read their interpreter article. So a lot of this I'm getting from them. Okay, so let's begin with the most common one, horses. Farrer states the last prehistoric North American horse, according to scientists, died out between 13,000 and 11,000 years ago at the end of the Pleistocene. Modern horses did not arrive in the New World until they were brought by Spanish explorers. So 3 apologetics. 1, horses were present, but their remains have not been found. And I also did a video around last October of recent findings of horse bones surrounded by strata material, and that it has been carbon dated to Book of Mormon time periods, I believe in southern Mexico. But the collagen in the bones hasn't been tested, so the results aren't definitive. Horses existing in Mesoamerica during Nephite time periods may not be an anachronism. And Brent Gardner says, he suggests caution in the firm declaration that there were no horses during the Book of Mormon times. Although not yet to the point that the evidence is widely accepted, the presence of the data introduces the possibility that the Book of Mormon horse might not be anachronistic after all. In short, the Book of Mormon claims only that horses were known to some New World peoples before the time of Christ, in certain limited regions of the New World. Thus, we need not conclude from the text that horses were universally known in the Americas throughout pre-Columbian history. And the second apologetic could be that the definition of a horse was expanded to new meanings, lone shifting. So that maybe the word horse doesn't actually mean horse, but this was the Nephites' lone shifting or translator's anachronism. The Book of Mormon never describes horses pulling chariots or being rode into battle. Horses didn't transform Nephite culture, although it does mention King Lamanite's horses and chariots. So it could be the possibility of an animal like a deer or a tapir resembling a horse to the Nephites, but not being a horse. But there's maybe some, growing possible evidence, not definitive yet, that horses may not be an anachronism. They may have existed in Mesoamerica, and that we're just waiting on archaeology to catch up. Or you might view in the Book of Mormon that the horse described in the Book of Mormon didn't function as a horse, that they weren't being rode upon, used in battles. Possible Nephite lone shift or translator's anachronism of an animal, maybe like a deer or a tapir. And even if horse bones were found and definitive, it also doesn't mean that the horse referred to in the Book of Mormon is in fact a horse. Okay, so what about elephants? So Miller favors the Columbian mammoth as the most likely candidate for the elephant that the Chariots would have encountered, as it has the closest resemblance to the African and Indian elephants that they would have encountered if they crossed West Asia before making their voyage to the Americas. Along with a number of large mammals thought to become extinct about 10,000 years ago, it's now known that the mammoth survived for a few thousand years longer. This was long enough to bring them to the time of the Chariots, A date for a mammoth in northern North America was cited at 3,700 years before the present. Wade E. Miller and Matthew Roper note that evidence for the survival of the elephant can be found in Native American myths and traditions. For example, the Naskapi people tell of a large monster that once trampled them and left deep tracks in the snow, had large ears and a long nose with which he hit people. So we're describing an elephant-sounding creature. So again, there's sort of like two apologetic answers to this. The elephants described in the Book of Mormon is actually a woolly mammoth, but it resembles an Indian elephant. And again, another lone shift, which could have survived into Jaredite time, which there's some evidence that mammoths survived past the Ice Age and possibly existing in Jaredite times. Or you could look at some of the Native American traditions describing an elephant-like creature, possibly suggesting that there were elephants here anciently, but we just haven't found them yet with archaeology. Okay, let's talk about like cattle, oxen, cows. Sorensen noticed some early Spanish explorers in America called the bison or American buffalo vaca, which means cow in Spanish. Although now extinct, the shrub ox and southern woodland musk ox could have survived well past the end of the Pleistocene. Bones of domesticated cattle have been reported from different caves in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico. With these cow and horse remains, human artifacts were found in association with them. The indication is that domesticated cattle and the horse coexisted with humans in pre-Columbian time. So when it comes to like cattle, oxen, the possibility it could be a lone shift, referring to like something like a bison. I think probably the best candidate would be the shrub ox. And also it's interesting, I think the evidence found in Yucatan of both domesticated horses and cattle. I'm not sure about if they test the bones and what time period it matches to. So I don't want to say that correlates with Book of Mormon times because I've not checked that. Sheep. So Miller and Roper say sheep were probably among the animals brought to America by the Jaredites. Although they were not stated explicitly by name, they most likely are to be included in the term flocks and are mentioned by the name in Ether. Several generations later, there are sheep native to America. The most common type of sheep is the mountain sheep. They're an animal that can be tamed or at least semi-domesticated. According to Geist, I think is how you say his name, it's hard to imagine a wild animal more readily tamed than mountain sheep. Petroglyphs from Mexico and southwestern United States show many prehistoric depictions of sheep. It appears certain that the association of sheep and man occurred in America before this animal was brought over, beginning in 1493 with Columbus's second voyage. So a possibility that the sheep spoken of in the Book of Mormon could be mountain sheep, native to Mesoamerica. What about goats and wild goats? Goats and wild goats are described in the Book of Mormon. Goats appear to be anachronistic. Miller and Roper have suggested the possibility of a lone shift of the red rocket deer being a goat-like animal described by the Spaniards as Native American goats. So goats definitely is anachronistic. There is the lone shift of the Spaniards thinking it looks similar to the little red rocket deer. So again, possibly a lone shift. Does specify the difference though between goats and wild goats. So this does present a problem, and you could also just view it as we've not found evidence of goats, and going back to the 1% of Mesoamerica being excavated. What about pigs? American peccaries, while not a true pig, the peccary, known throughout much of Mesoamerica and South America, is most definitely a pig-like beast and is closely related to it. The early Spanish who encountered them called them pigs. Okay, so let's move away from animals and let's look at metallurgy. So critics would point to metallurgy being an anachronism in the Book of Mormon, such as like iron, steel, swords, etc. So John Sorensen states, there are over 150 specimens of metal that have been recovered archaeologically that definitely or probably date as much as 1500 years earlier than the time of the supposed AD 900 metallurgical curtain. Although Sorensen said he had several hundred specimens of smelted metal from the Book of Mormon time periods, he acknowledged that most archaeologists would dismiss them. And again, going back to the 1% of Mesoamerica being excavated, this could be a problem with archaeology that we just haven't found evidence of smelted metals across Mesoamerica. Okay, let's talk a little bit about swords in the Book of Mormon. So the Book of Mormon does indicate some swords were made of metal, such as the Jaredites and Nephi's steel sword of Laban. It is an assumption that all swords are therefore steel swords, but that only the elite among the Nephites and Jaredites likely had metal swords. These were more exceptional and rare, and that most of them did not. Recent scholarship on Book of Mormon warfare suggests that the Mesoamerican weapon, the maquatil, fits the criteria for the Book of Mormon's sword. Many Mesoamerican peoples describe the weapon as a sword. It is a wooden club with obsidian flakes, giving it a deadly cutting edge, and is a good candidate for the sword that Ammon used in chopping off the arms of the Lamanites who scattered the king's flock, and better for slicing and chopping as opposed to a steel sword, which is better for thrusting and stabbing. The cutting power of the obsidian edge of the maquatil was renowned at the time of the Spanish conquest. There's a tale of a Maya warrior who cut off the head of a Spaniard's horse with one blow of a maquatil. This comes from LDS Truth Claims, their summary on metal, and I would recommend watching his series as he goes through this in his episodes. So iron and steel is mentioned in the Book of Mormon, and it occurs when the Nephites are in Highland, Guatemala, according to Sorensen's model, where we find deposits of iron ore. It is clear Nephi had the ability and taught it to his people. However, there is no indication it was taught to the surrounding culture. If the Nephites stopped using metal, it could have been the lack of available ore or the loss of the skill being passed down. So Sorensen points to dating to before most archaeologists believe the smelting of metals happened. There is some evidence of iron ore in the highlands of Guatemala, where the Nephites under Sorensen's model would have first inhabited or lived. And there is some indication of metal steel swords in the Book of Mormon, such as the Chariots or Laban's sword that Nephi had. But really, there isn't actually much other mention of metallurgy in the Book of Mormon, and the maquatil is probably a good candidate for the weapon that Ammon used and in other Nephite battles. Okay, let's have a look at some final anachronisms. Silk. Sorensen says that linen and silk are textiles mentioned in the Book of Mormon, but that neither fabric, as we know them, was found in Mesoamerica at the coming of the Spaniards. But there are several kinds of silk that were reported by the conquerors. Other reports indicate that wild silk was spun and woven in certain areas of Mesoamerica. And also getting back to the acidic soils, that silk is something that would very easily disintegrate as well and not be found. So there's no evidence of silk as we know it today, and it may have been a similar material resembling silk that the ancients had. Okay, what about chariots? This is an interesting one. So Brant Gardner says, because part of the argument against chariots has been the presumed ignorance of the wheel and axle, LDS scholars have emphasized the evidence that the wheel and axle were known. Several small ancient ceremonial objects with wheels have been recovered. Although that shows there was pre-Columbian knowledge of the wheel and axle, it really doesn't tell us about chariots or any other large wheeled vehicle, which are still unknown to exist during Book of Mormon times. So there's still no evidence of chariots existing. There are small toys showing that there is maybe some knowledge of the wheel, but there's no evidence that can be pointed to any carts with wheels or chariots. Gardner also says that chariots could also be an issue of translation, that it may not be a chariot as we understand it. LDS Truth Claims goes on to say, like horses, chariots are never used in battle in the Book of Mormon, but for formal visits, and we need not assume they are the same as old world chariots. A litter, which is a non-wheeled vehicle wherein a rider was carried by a servant, which Maya kings traveled on, could be a candidate. Could be a candidate for King Lamoni's chariot. So you have to say, though, when it talks about like getting his horse and chariot, I know what would come into my head is when a horse and chariot go together and the horse pulls the chariot. So I know to a critic, they may not find this a very good apologetic explanation. Because I'm kind of thinking in my head, if they went with the litter, would the horse-like creature have traveled with them? I don't know. What about coins in the Book of Mormon? So the actual text of the 1830 Book of Mormon does not mention coins. The word coins was added in the 1920 edition to the chapter heading for Alma 11. And seeing coins in the Book of Mormon occurs when readers apply their modern expectations and inadequately close reading of the text. There are units of exchange in the Book of Mormon, but no coins explicitly. So it was just put in the chapter heading, but it doesn't actually talk about coins. What about Christ's name? Christ is the Greek word for the Hebrew word Messiah. It is no more anachronistic for pre-Christian era Book of Mormon peoples to believe in a coming Messiah, Christ, than it was for Old Testament prophets to believe in a coming Messiah, Christ. The Book of Mormon is a translation of an ancient Nephite text. The word Christ is a Greek word that means the same as the Hebrew word, Messiah as in the anointed one. And Jacob and also King Benjamin said that they were told by the angel the name of Christ as well in the Book of Mormon. So they claim that's how they learned the name of Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ is the translation from whatever was on the gold plates to what we have in our modern English translation. So I referenced this also in a previous video, but I thought I mentioned it again, that prior to 600 BC and Josiah's reforms, that there was a temple tradition and an atoning Messiah in Jerusalem had among the Jews prior to Josiah's reforms. Nephi saw the de-emphasis on the atoning mission of the Messiah as an unfortunate result of Josiah's reforms. The original temple tradition was that Yahweh the Lord was the Son of the God Most High and was present on earth as the Messiah. This means that the older religion in Israel would have taught about the Messiah. Thus, finding Christ in the Old Testament is exactly what we should expect. This next one was asked me by a listener to cover, and it's why does the Book of Mormon talk about churches? So this comes from Fair. Church denotes any convocation or gathering of individuals, whether secular or religious in nature. A couple of Hebrew terms for this have been translated in the Greek Septuagint as gathering or church. This may not fully resolve the issue of translation for everyone, since these nouns most often are translated as assembly, gathering, multitude, company, and so forth, but this requires that we review Joseph Smith's view of translation, review Joseph Smith's role as translator, and if we allow room for Joseph's most commonly used vernacular to be acceptable as part of the translation of the Book of Mormon. Okay, so if we allow that for some of these anachronisms, either being a lone shift or a translator's anachronism, and Joseph Smith playing an active role in the translation of the Book of Mormon, his own vocabulary and vernacular, then how do we explain animals like then curlums or cumums? I've not found any great answers to this. There's some speculation over what a curlum or cumum might be. Apologists state it seems likely that Joseph Smith apparently wasn't able to relate them with any living animals, and he seems to have simply transliterated the words on the gold plates from which he was translating. My also thoughts as a possibility, and Brian Garner sort of alluded to this in our interview as a possible explanation, is that Ether is Moroni's translation of the Book of Ether. He didn't know what a curlum or cumum was, so he just transliterated it into Mormon's record. Other animals might have been a lone shift of the Nephites, but curlum and cumum were just left as names that they didn't know the meaning of. As Joseph was translating Mormon's record, curlum and cumum was just left as a name which he transliterated. Obviously, to a critic, they would probably see this as speculation, and Joseph Smith is just making up random words. So, no, to a critic, they might roll their eyes at maybe some of these apologetic responses, that the lone shifting, it's quite convenient. If we don't have evidences of certain animals like horses, chariots, elephants, steel swords, when it was referring to an elephant, it was maybe a mammoth, or a horse, it was a tapir or a deer. Steel sword is really a wood club with obsidian on it, or a chariot was really like this Mayan litter that the kings were carried on. And I can truly understand why to a critic, they would see it as this is just trying to provide, some excuses or some way around these anachronisms. And I don't even find the lone shifting apologetic really, it's not the route I would go down. I probably would lean more towards we've not found everything there is to find. I allow room that the Nephites, if they were ancient peoples, they could have engaged in lone shifting like other ancient peoples. But it also gets into the realm of like, does anything mean anything? But what I would say about the lone shifting apologetic is I don't think the apologists are presenting this as like, this is what it means, but just as a possibility. Obviously, we're all speculating when it comes to these, but it's something that ancient peoples did do. So I also think it's possible that like if a Nephi author wrote pig, they could have been referring to the peccary. I don't think it has to look like a pig as I would see it at the farm. So one final faithful argument, before I wrap up on anachronisms, this has been quite a long video, is that there's been, less anachronisms over time, and certain items which were once considered to be an anachronism have later been discovered not to be. Examples being things such as like metal plates, barley, cement, which during Joseph's time were all anachronisms, but with time have been found. And perhaps one should be more cautious to say that something is a definitive anachronism, where with time and archaeology, it could be discovered. And that as knowledge and archaeology expands, what was once an anachronism may turn out to be a legitimate feature of the ancient world. Growing body of evidence from New World archaeology that supports the Book of Mormon and results from LiDAR surveys in Mesoamerica continue to reveal the infrastructure is consistent with the Book of Mormon. And we're going to discuss more in the next video, sort of like LiDAR and things in archaeology and things which seem to be consistent or fit with the text of the Book of Mormon, because I think that should also be taken into account in light of these anachronisms and some of the problems. So Farr would conclude on anachronisms. While the initial recognition of anachronisms in a text can appear overwhelming at first, they do not have to remain that way if one is willing to adjust their expectations appropriately, given what we know about archaeology today, the nature of revelation, and the origins of Joseph Smith's scriptural productions. Matthew Roper has a chart which he presented at a Fair Mormon conference, comparing sort of like the number of Book of Mormon anachronisms in 1966 to 2019, and showing how many we have found since then. So he states in the chart that about 70% of claimed anachronisms from critics have been found through archaeology. Around 10-11% is trending, and that remains about 20%, which are still anachronisms. Some critics dispute this chart and these findings. For example, Jeremy in a CS letter. And again, with less than 1% of Mesoamerican archaeological sites being excavated, and with more discoveries happening, particularly with the recent LiDAR technology discoveries happening in the past few years, one should maybe be cautious saying that something is a definitive anachronism and that things in the Book of Mormon do not fit with what we know about Mesoamerica. And I like this quote from Tad R. Callister. He has to say this about anachronisms. To some extent, these critics unwittingly do Joseph in the Book of Mormon great service every time they accuse Joseph of an anachronism, such as metal plate, cement, or barley. They strengthen Joseph's prophetic claim. Why? Because in their dogged certainty that they know the real truth is supported by science, only later to be proven wrong, they have heightened the probability that Joseph could not have known the real truth except through divine means. And what I would say about these remaining anachronisms, it's a fallacy to believe that, okay, we definitely will, just because there's less anachronisms over time, that therefore means we definitely will find the rest of them. But it also means that but it definitely doesn't mean we definitely won't as well. Again, if not everything has been excavated and more discoveries are happening. Roper also notes that some of these same problems exist for biblical archaeology, and that certain cities have not been found, and that there's no archaeological evidence for some of the patriarchs like Abraham or Moses outside the Bible, yet Christians still believe in its authenticity. And he finishes with the famous quote that absence of evidence is not necessarily and should be conflated with evidence of absence. Okay, so this has been a super long video. Quite frankly, I'm tired and I need to shut up and let you get back to your own day. But let me just summarize what we've gone through in a nutshell. So critics would point to that there are anachronisms in the Book of Mormon, such as horses, elephants, cattle, goats, silk, chariots, wheat. I forgot about wheat. Oh well. So critics would point to that these anachronisms in the Book of Mormon show that it's not historical, as it doesn't fit in time and place in ancient America, and it's obviously a 19th century text. They would also point to things, we didn't talk too much about this in Mesoamerica, that exist in Mesoamerica, but that aren't discussed in the Book of Mormon, like jaguars, cocoa beans, turkeys, monkeys, etc., which I think is a credible argument. So apologists state that there's a couple of reasons for the anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. One, with archaeology, we've not found everything that there is to find, with less than 1% of archaeological sites being excavated. And with recent LiDAR technology, we're discovering more and more. So what was once considered to be anachronism may not be with future discoveries, and that we may just have to have patience. So we should be cautious saying that it's a definitive anachronism because it still may be found. Second possibility is it could be loan shifting, or ancient peoples referring to an unfamiliar animal, calling it something that they were familiar to. For example, the Nephites calling a peccary a pig, or a translator's anachronism, such as when the King James Bibles translators translated putting candlestick for the oil lamps, but candlesticks didn't exist then, but it's to make it more readable and understandable to their audience, and the possibility Joseph Smith might have been doing that in mimicking the language and also the animals talked about in the King James Bible. Apologists point to that there has been less and less anachronisms over time, going in favor of the Book of Mormon and discovery of items such as cement, metal plate, barley, and that the Book of Mormon is looking less ridiculous over time. So critics would probably view the loan shifting apologetic as this is maybe just Weasley or trying to stretch and find maybe some excuses and pointing to maybe some vague similarities between like a horse and a horse-like creature. So my thoughts, doing this, I can really see the critics' arguments. There are these outstanding anachronisms, and I can totally find why they might find referring the horses in the Book of Mormon being a tapir kind of funny or ridiculous. And to me, I don't think I would find a lone shift being the answer to every single one. I do allow room for the possibility that the Nephites may have called certain animals, new unfamiliar animals in the New World, the same name as animals in the Old World, like the peccary and the pig, or being a translator's anachronism. But I think I would lean towards that we've not found everything that there is in Mesoamerica, and with time we might find more. Maybe patience is needed, similar to problems with biblical archaeology. And yeah, even though there's outstanding anachronisms, doesn't mean that we definitely will find those in the future, but also doesn't mean that we definitely won't. I also think with LiDAR technology and just more discoveries, and also the growing evidence that converges with the text of the Book of Mormon should be taken into account as we examine the different anachronisms. And we'll be talking more about that in the next video. So really in the next few episodes, I'm going to be orienting away from criticisms against the Book of Mormon. I think I've tackled the majority of the main criticisms. And I'm going to be focusing more towards like positive evidence to support the Book of Mormon. So we're going to be looking at things to do with archaeology, or things in both the Old World and New World which seem to converge with the Book of Mormon. And also some future episodes, just so you know what we're going to be covering. We're going to be looking at the complexity of the Book of Mormon, ancient elements in the Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith's skills. Could he have composed the Book of Mormon himself? We're also going to be having a look at the witnesses of the Book of Mormon, the translation process, and also the gold plates. And then examining the different authorship theories, the naturalistic explanations. And then we're going to touch on some of the translation theories before I give my final summary and final thoughts on the Book of Mormon. But if you enjoyed this one, like, share, and subscribe. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. So a possibility that the sheep spoken of in the Book of Mormon could be mountain sheep, native to Mesoamerica. Pardon. The cutting power of the obsidian edge of the Makwahitl was renowned. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon, or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.